Hello, my name is Ethan Cat, and recently I competed in my first ever Combat Patrol tournament. End of introduction. While you might know me, Ethan, from the litany of Warhammer 400,000 content I've made in the past, you may be surprised to learn that I haven't actually played that many games of the game. That's right. Frustratingly, the people in my comments section annoyingly classifying me as a tourist at least have some manner of credibility. To that end, it may come as a revelation that I have never played a full game of Warhammer 40,000 Combat Patrol, despite the fact that that's the version of the game that you're recommended to start with. I mean, I just dove into a full 1,000 point of orcs because I'm built different. Also, whenever I find a super crunchy game like this, I spend literal days of my life just going over the rulebook, thinking about strategies and how they'll play out in actual tabletop game. And they never do. And so when I found that my local gaming store was holding a Combat Patrol tournament that was open to anybody and legally couldn't say no to me being there, I couldn't help but jump at the chance to sign up. My first foray into the orcs as an army was with the original Combat Patrol. No, not the one with the Beast Snagger boys that's arguably better value and way cooler, this one. That came with just a fuck ton of boys and these Defcopters, whose rotors always fall off in transit 100% of the time. If you're thinking about investing in a box of Defcopters, bring super glue. Now, was this a professional tournament with prize money and status up for grabs? Absolutely not. If we were judging this tournament on the Smash Brothers scale of competitiveness, we would be all the way into for fun, baby. But of course, that didn't stop me from poring over all of the data sheets and strategies for my Combat Patrol weeks before the event, nor did it stop me from immediately forgetting all of them the second I started rolling dice. The tournament setup was simple. You play 3 games, try to win as many as possible, and it's Combat Patrol. You know, now that I'm thinking about it, it was less of a tournament and more just a come and play games at our space kind of thing. I mean, calling it a tournament's probably better for the video, so I'm just going to stick with that. Going into the event, I had one simple strategy. Get up in my opponent's grill and stay there for as long as fucking possible. One of the benefits that the Orcs Combat Patrol has over other Combat Patrols is that you just have a shit ton of boys at your disposal. Specifically, you have 20 of them, plus some other guys, but if you compare that to the likes of a Custodian Combat Patrol, who has, from memory, I believe, 7 men, you at least have some warm bodies to work with. Bodies I would happily throw into the meat grinders of my enemies to gum up their cogs as much as possible. The war boss in Mega Armor, Def Dread, and Defcopters do pack a bit of a punch, but mostly within melee range. It is incredibly rare to find an Orc's datasheet with a ballistic skill of less than 5+, and this Combat Patrol is no exception. So mentally, I was preparing that for the first couple of rounds of my Combat Patrol games, I would get shot at. A lot. Basically, my strategy was to declare the war as soon as possible, make use of the feel no pain that it provides, push up into the board as quickly as possible, and hopefully all of my guys aren't shot to death before they get there. From there, I just have to kind of figure it out. Luckily, to alleviate this fear of being shot, a fear which permeates both my tabletop and IRL life, the war boss had this handy enhancement, the name of which I've already completely forgotten. Basically, it would halve the damage of any ranged attack that was trying to hit my war boss to make sure that he would still have some wounds remaining by the time he got within the melee range of literally anything else. That being said, the number one thing that I found about the war boss in Mega Armor is that people tended to not shoot him because they figured that he couldn't shoot anything back. Mostly because, and I know this is probably pretty unique to me, he's got a giant bomb hammer, which I guess is distracting enough from the tiny little man on top of his head with a heavy machine gun. Basically, anytime it got to my first shooting phase and my war boss actually shot my opponent's back, they were pretty surprised. Anyway, I figured if I could rush in hard, fast, or any other adjective that would prompt a your mum joke from a 12-year-old, I figured I had pretty good chances of success. And then I faced the Tyranids. My first opponent of the Combat Patrol tournament was playing with the Tyranids Combat Patrol. These are some scary bugs. One thing that I knew was going to work for me going into this tournament was knowing that the Orcs Combat Patrol has a very high quantity of models at its disposal. Unfortunately, so do the Tyranids. Not only that, but the Tyranids are also slightly better at shooting than the Orcs, so my big fear was that I'd be shot to death before the time I got to the end of the table and could actually whack anyone with a stick. Fortunately, the cover for this game was pretty advantageous in my favor. Also, neither of us really knew what we were doing. Literally, this was the first ever Combat Patrol game for both me and my opponent, and I think we played the entire game with lethal hits on just everything. Like, literally, anytime we rolled a 6 on a dice, we were just like, yeah, that hits, right? It's a critical hit. Dungeons and Dragons, thankfully for me, my opponent was a little bit more reserved in terms of pushing up onto the board and taking objectives. I, for one, always love to rush to the main center objective like I'm playing a King of the Hill map in Team Fortress 2, but it seemed as though my opponent was more focused on hanging backwards and shooting me with deadly bone guns. Which is a sound enough strategy, I suppose. Thankfully, through applying pressure in the early game, I was able to push up into the middle of the board and take some key objectives, which earned me some good victory points early in the game. And then I got jumped by a winged Tyranid Prime. Now, I wasn't particularly fazed about the winged Tyranid Prime. I figured that if I could just shove a battalion of boys right up into its face, I could at least stop it from pushing into the center objectives and taking those victory points from me. You know, just build a barricade of bodies so it can't move forward. And to my credit, this worked pretty well for me. Until I realized that anytime the winged Tyranid Prime kills something with melee weapons, it earns victory points. Fuck. Basically, by throwing a unit of boys right up against the winged Tyranids Prime, I was basically giving my opponent half of the victory points they managed to get for that game, simply because there was so much flesh to cut down. That, and the fact that the Tyranid Prime gets victory points anytime it ends a phase where it kills something, which means I basically gave my opponent victory points on my turn. I always get so caught up in the rush of beating something to death with my bare hands in Warhammer that I forget that after that's done, they have a chance to hit me back. That's how I've lost like 80% of my units in my career here. In any case, thanks to putting pressure on the control points early in the game, I was able to score enough victory points to take home the victory. That, and the fact that I think my opponent never actually pulled this guy out of Deep Strike, who was just off the board the entire time. Anytime you start to play games like this, 90% of the games you lose early in your career is literally just because you have a loaded gun that you just forget to use. Like, you could just have an atom bomb sitting off to the side in your reserves and just forget that it exists. And that could have saved you the entire game. But in any case, my opponent was lovely, the game was fun, and then I got to move on to round 2, where I faced off against the Necrons. Now, the Necron Combat Patrol has significantly less units than that of the Tyranids, which should come as a relief, but is actually far scarier. Like, when an army has 1,000 little dudes running across the table all at once, you at least have the knowledge that those dudes are probably gonna die in one shot. When an army has, like, 5 things in it, you know those are 5 significant problems that you are gonna have to deal with that are going to be incredibly difficult to kill. I mean, I don't know the data sheets of what's in the Necron army, so I don't 100% know. All I know is that there's a War of the Worlds walker that's fucking terrifying. Again, I was very scared of getting shot halfway across the map before my boys could dive in and actually do any damage, and I was even more scared that this fucking thing could see me anywhere on the map, regardless of terrain. Like, how can you hide from this thing? Like, it's just... At the very least, I had confidence that my war boss in Mega Armor would survive long enough to get within melee range because of this aforementioned enhancement, which again halved all damage from ranged attacks. Not a single ranged attack was allocated to my war boss in Mega Armor. This also wasn't because my opponent knew that it would take half damage, they just didn't shoot him. Like, why wouldn't you? Like, he's clearly the biggest, most threatening thing on the field. Actually, in hindsight, it's probably the Death Dread, which did get shot a lot, so maybe they knew what they were doing. In this match, the Death Copters were really the linchpin for me. My boys, Warboss and Death Dread, needed to survive long enough on the battlefield to charge through towards the enemy lines. The Death Copters, however, were set up in strategic reserves, and, thanks to the Deep Strike ability, could basically spawn in the enemy's backline and get right up in the grill of this fucking walker. I had zero confidence that my Death Copters would actually be able to kill this walker. Like, the only melee options the Death Copters had were their spinning rotors, which, you know, is a high quantity, low strength attack, so I didn't think they were going to be able to kill the walker, but they would at least get it engaged within melee combat so it wasn't able to shoot anything. And then I learned that vehicles can shoot while still engaged in melee. That was a surprise for me. I thought I had a big brain move going on, but I just didn't. That being said, the Death Copters were at least distracting enough to get the walker to roll like garbage, and thankfully all of my boys survived. For a while. This is one of those games where most of my units got absolutely deleted by the enemy team. However, I was able to push up on the board early enough and gain victory points from the command points that I was able to control to basically win the game through victory points. Which, now that I say that out loud, is how you win games. Like, by technicality, you get the higher victory points, you win. Like, that's how the game works. I think I literally had like one Death Copter left on the field while every other unit that I had been entirely destroyed, and I still won. Which makes sense. Anyway, if there's only one thing you take away from this, let it be this. Don't just try and kill everyone. Like, actually, play the objectives. It's an objective game. Also, I was really excited to play this guy because they had the best painted army out of anybody in the tournament. Which I know makes it sound like I'm talking shit about everybody else's paint jobs, but I'm not. It was just that good. Now, I have a personal policy about not taking pictures of people's stuff or things and posting that on the internet because that's an egregious violation of privacy. So I'm going to do my best to describe to you how cool these paint jobs were. So you can see here through my artistic rendition of what they looked like, they were like Necrons, except they were painted to be like stony and earthy. Like, the guy told me he put, like, actual, like, basing cement, like, the kind that gives bases that really sort of, like, crackly earth texture. Like, he put that on top of the model itself and put, like, you know, basing tufts and, you know, all the, like, fake grass on top of the Necrons as well. So they look like stone Necrons that had, like, been made out of marble or rock rather than, you know, metal. And he also had these really cool, like, resin crystals on the base. Like, I don't know how he painted these things up, but they looked translucent. Like, they couldn't have been painted that way. But yeah, I just thought that the way that he put, like, the basing cement on top of the model itself to give it, like, that really sort of, like, craggly earth texture was... It was really cool. You know. So... Also, at the end of the tournament, we all voted for who we thought had the best paint job, and, like, the rankings sheet looked like this. I got a vote though. That one was me. But no, another super lovely game with a super lovely opponent, and everyone had a great time. And then came the chaos. I was pretty nervous about this one, not gonna lie. Like, I knew my opponent was gonna be tough. Like, before the game, I caught them having a conversation with somebody else about how they basically have every combat patrol in existence and just felt like playing Chaos today. And let me tell you, as soon as we started sitting down to play this game, we were fucking off, baby. I do not know mechanically how the Chaos Space Marines work, and after playing against them, I still don't. I feel like with every 7 seconds that passed, my opponent claimed that they were making a dark pact for sustained hits, or brutal cunning, or 1,000 other things, which I just had to sit there and go, okay. Like, honestly, they could have been making up shit. Like, they were speaking with such authority that I was like, okay. But the basic gist that I got was my opponent could make a bit of a gamble on whether they wanted a bonus that would help them out or to take some instant mortal wounds. They never got the wounds. My opponent's Chaos Space Marines were buffed literally every round of the game, and there was absolutely no consequence to that. And I'm not saying that's a broken game mechanic or the game is bugged or whatever the fuck you might want to twist my words into thinking I'm saying. They just rolled very, very good. Nevertheless, I still tried to go with my currently undefeatable strategy of just charging into the midboard as soon as possible and getting all up in my opponent's grill. It only kinda worked this time. This time, more than anything, my orcs were absolutely shredded before they could get into melee range of pretty much anybody. And sure, part of this was thanks to tactical cover, you know, creative uses of Overwatch. However, there was also a far more sinister force at play. Absolutely fucked up charge rolls. I was able to close the distance with pretty much every one of my units and get within 6 to 10 inches of my opponents, and I fucked up the charge roll every time. And of course, as we all know, when you fail a charge roll, you just don't move, which is a mechanic that has never quite made sense to me. Like, everyone's like, come on boys, get in there! Oh, we can't get in there? Well, I guess we'll just sit and wait and let them try and shoot for another round, I guess. Considering that the Havocs of the Chaos Space Marines had rocket launchers, which of course, understandably have the blast keyword, they were able to absolutely shred my boys before they ever got within melee range and could actually be a credible threat. By the time I was able to close the distance and actually get close enough to hit them, it didn't matter that half of the Chaos Space Marines didn't have proper melee weapons. They would just beat me to death with the butt of a rocket launcher like in Halo 3. But you might be thinking, Ethan, doesn't your war boss take half damage against all ranged attacks that are allocated towards him? Nobody shot him! Again! Like, I have the choice of one of two enhancements to take on the orcs, and every game I chose the one that never came into play. I could have teleporting boys. This time, my strategy of pushing hard and pushing early didn't quite work out in my favor as much as it did in previous games. And that wasn't for lack of trying, mind you. I tried. A lot. Poor advance rolls and poor charge rolls left me incredibly vulnerable to enemy fire, and because of that, I lost a lot of good boys on the field of battle, and honestly, I think I'm still mourning. That being said, my hard and fast tactics did allow me to score a bunch of victory points early in the game. Unfortunately for me, I wasn't able to score anything after that. You see, the secondary objective I was playing with on the Orcs Combat Patrol is get that loot, or loot the objective, or whatever the fuck it was. It was something like that. Basically, anytime I had control over an objective marker that wasn't within my home base, I was able to loot it to score some additional victory points. This allows the Orcs Combat Patrol to score victory points very easy and very early. However, it prevents you from scoring any victory points after that. I was only able to loot objective markers once, which allowed me to score a lot of victory points early, but I also wasn't able to punch through enemy lines, get to the control point behind the enemy's territory, and loot that one. So I was kind of shit out of luck. Also, when you loot an objective marker, you have to make a roll to see how many victory points you get. If you roll a 1, you don't get anything. I rolled a 1. And when you consider how small Combat Patrol games are, you really need those secondary objectives in order to rack up victory points outside of just sitting on capture points. And so when you have a secondary objective which has the ability to net you absolutely nothing, that's pretty significant if you have shitty luck like me. This was the only game that I played where my entire army got absolutely wiped, which was really hilarious because at one point I was just literally one knob against an entire army of Chaos Space Marines who survived for a surprisingly long amount of time. I literally had no choice but to call the war with like 4 dudes remaining, and only one guy was left on the field. One man. At that point, it wasn't even about getting victory points for me. Like, I just needed to get to the end of round 5 with this one guy still alive, and I could take that as a moral victory. I did not. As a result, I did end up losing this game. However, I only lost it by 5 victory points, which, if I had rolled high on one of my looting rolls, I could have absolutely drawn the tie. So I'm taking that as a win for me. I think I got too cocky. Like, I had 2 very tasty victories early that day, and I felt invincible and though I could do anything. And I literally changed nothing and just rolled worse, so actually I don't think that did anything at all. But at the end of the day, one of my favorite things about Warhammer as a game is that even when I'm losing, or even when I'm absolutely getting tabled, it's still fun. Like, I was literally thinking about it on the walk home, going like, if I just nailed that charge roll, if I just rolled better here, like, I could have got it. I was so close. And it's that closeness to me that is really the most exciting thing. Like, you're always one dice roll away between victory and defeat, and that's just, better than sex. Like, even when you're getting smashed, even when you're getting tabled, there's always that little part of you that's like, ooh, you can just make it if you just try this thing, if you just use this stratagem, or if you just call the wah. I don't know if that makes sense, but I fucking love it, man. I love this fucking game. I mean that both, and honestly, I mean that both in terms of Warhammer 40,000 and Combat Patrol itself. I'm not gonna lie, I was kind of worried that Combat Patrol would just feel like a watered down version of the full 40k experience, but I was actually pleasantly surprised. It really does feel like you're playing a really tight, small-scale game of 40k. And it also feels really great that you can actually get the thing done within 30 minutes to an hour, and not 2 calendar days. And you don't have to worry about list building, or metas, or all of that weird, crunchy stuff. All you have to do is get sat in front of an opponent, go, okay, this is what you're working with, how can I demolish this? Like, it was really scary seeing that Necron Walker set up on the table on the opposite side of me. It really made me feel like, oh shit, this thing can absolutely fuck me up. How am I gonna deal with this? Whereas I feel like in a full game of 40k, you'd have the same experience and go, yo, this thing can absolutely destroy me, but I could destroy it if I only had these 8 units that I don't currently have with me or don't own, but I could buy from gamesworkshop.shop.com. I think I just clocked Warhammer's entire business model. Now, the worst part about all of this is that I'm sitting here having had a great time and a great experience out playing this game, and now the only thing going through my mind is, wow, that was great! I could totally buy another combat patrol and do it again. So anyway, I have a Kofi now. I mean, I did also get started with the Leviathan set, which is pretty much just the Space Marines and the Tyranids Combat Patrol. So... Anyway, bottom line is I had a really fun time playing this awesome game with these cool models that I painted all up on myself, and was really great to see them all on a table and all that hard work paying off, and now that I'm here, I don't think there was any grand major point to this video other than me just talking about a thing that I liked and a good experience that I had. Yeah, maybe I'll buy the Dark Angels Combat Patrol next.